Hello and welcome to the Business of Aging podcast. My name is Sean Alexander, and each episode I sit down with leaders of the seniors living industry for an honest, thought-provoking conversation on how to improve the lives of older Australians. The Business of Aging is brought to you by Plus Communities. Plus builds fully customisable, branded apps for seniors living organisations looking to centralise communication between staff, residents and their families. When most people think of aged care, they picture tired, dark old buildings that feel and act more like hospitals. A necessary evil that is a last resort when all other methods of independent living have failed. Architect Lara Calder is determined to change that perception, believing that there is no reason why the last place that you call home in this world can't also be one of the best. Through thoughtful environmental design that connects people with the memory-inducing sensory experiences of the outdoors, Lara's vision is to create spaces that bring delight and joy to both residents and the staff who care for them. In this episode of The Business of Aging, we will also discuss new alternate models of seniors housing, including co-generational communities and small household co-living developments that are starting to gain some real traction. So prepare to be inspired as nurse-turned-architect Lara Calder and the brave clients she works with transform the concept of what home means for people as they age. Hi Lara, welcome to the Business of Aging.
Hi Sean, thanks for having me.
You started your career as a registered nurse before going on to study architecture. What made you want to make that change? Did you feel that architecture was always your calling? Or had nursing really run its course for you?
It was a bit like that. I always wanted to do something creative. And then when I left school, I was going to study fine art. And my family hit a bit of a financial bump. And so nursing just seemed like a good out at the time because I could leave home, I could live in the nurse's res, I could earn an income and qualify. And I'd done a student nurse program at school. And so I did it as a sort of temporary stopgap. But once I was in it, I actually really enjoyed it. I was quite an introverted, shy graduate, and just getting into that nursing clinical world really opened my eyes to people and life and experiences that people had, the vulnerabilities of people when they are in an uncertain environment. And just, I suppose also because I was always interested in architecture, because my family was, that whole psychology of the environment and the spaces and how it really affected people's well-being and sense of safety. I was interested in doing something else after the nursing. So when I finished that, I went and studied interior design. After the first year of that, when they had been saying the whole way through the course, once the architect has designed the space, and once the architect has given you the plans, and once the architect has a vision, I thought I need to be the architect.
So there was an obvious hierarchy, and you thought, well, I might not be setting myself up to be up the top here.
That's right. And so then I just quietly sort of went and applied to university and went and studied architecture. And I loved it. I just felt like I was in my right space. I just was in the right groove. I had a fantastic class, great lecturers. So this is all in South Africa. And while I was studying architecture, I kept nursing, so I had to support myself. So I worked on the campus health clinic and I worked night duties at various private clinics. But as well, I did a lot of private agency nursing, looking after people in their homes. And a lot of those people were older people.
So the equivalent of what we call home care now.
Exactly. So it was mostly sort of overnight, just looking after someone in their apartment or their house. And it was a really good learning curve. So I always imagined that I would combine the design side of architecture and the health side into some sort of meaningful work later.
How did those sort of years working on the front line influence the direction that you wanted to go in once you had graduated?
It influenced me to a point. I did initially think I wanted to do hospital design and went and worked deliberately for firms that did hospitals. When I moved to Australia, I worked for BVN on the St Vincent's Hospital. Hospitals are full of red tape. There's a huge amount of rules around hospitals. And, I had these great ideas that I was going to change the world with new hospital design, but it's hard to do. And then I started having children and set up my own practice, doing mostly residential projects because that was the work that was easy to get. We had built our own house, and so off the back of that, people were asking me to do their houses. And then one day, a client that we had done a house for contacted me and said he was a retirement living developer and would be interested in looking at doing a retirement village for him. So that kind of opened the door to what that world was, because I hadn't really sort of ever thought about it before. wasn't on my radar. Aged care as a building type wasn't something I had actually really had much experience with.
And when you had that conversation and started to consider residential aged care and from a design point of view, what did you see as the opportunity? What did you see that you could bring to this space?
Well, I needed to learn a bit about it because I didn't know. So I went and did a bit of research around it and actually booked into a couple of talks and seminars. And one of them was a day at the Architects Institute of different architects talking about aged care and their projects and their work. And it was there that I met John Flower and went and introduced myself to him and said, I'm interested in doing aged care. And he looked at me and he said, what's wrong with you? No one wants to do aged care. And then we sort of formed a bit of a friendship and started doing a couple of projects together in association with the two practices. It was just really interesting learning about it. And I think I was drawn to it because suddenly I started noticing these buildings in the suburban landscape, and they were ugly buildings, and they weren't always buildings that looked friendly or welcoming. And then I started hearing conversations about it, and people typically say, shoot me before I go into one of those places. They're filled with fear. The whole sort of psychology of residential care is not a positive one. And I thought through bringing really good design, good environmental design, you could try and change that perception of what those buildings could offer to actually be a place that people sought out and wanted to live in.
That is really, really true. I think that stigma has been around in aged care forever, as long as I can remember. How, as an industry, can we overcome that stigma for would-be residents and their families?
We are, and the industry as a whole is really quite focused on change. We're in really interesting times now because there's a lot of change coming from the government and from a lot of, the higher powers that control the direction of care. Obviously, there's a greater cohort of older people coming through, and people are really sort of trying to gear up for the boomer wave that they call, the silver tsunami, whatever they call it. And, there's a bit of a marketing piece around that and sort of capturing those dollars. But I think the big thing is that cohort of people are a lot more discerning. They're a lot more sophisticated. And in the past, people were quite happy to accept the sad little nursing home at the end of the street as the ultimate destination when you were really old. And now people are questioning that and saying, well, no, I don't want that. This is, I'm not like that. So we need a greater range of choice and quality. But also, I suppose the big changes in funding are really sort of geared towards trying to help people stay at home longer. So home care is a part of that. And, residential care was really scrutinised through the COVID pandemic. And then the Royal Commission into aged care and the quality of aged care brought and highlighted a lot of the problems in aged care into the public forum. So aged care is also a really challenging space to make money in. So a lot of providers are really struggling financially to be profitable with residential care. I believe in residential aged care. I think it still has a place in society, and it just has to be done really well. If it's the last place you're going to live in, maybe it can be the best place you're going to live in. Like, really shoot for the stars, aim high.
I love that idea.
And there's the Eagles song, the Hotel California, that says, you can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave. And that's a little bit like that. And you do check in and you don't leave unless, you're done. But I think even like Hotel California, it can just be a really slightly creative, eccentric space. It's very sort of risk averse and overly legislated in some ways for safety and compliance, and it kind of limits a little bit of the innovation. And I think residential aged care could be a little bit more fun. But yeah, from an architectural and design point of view, there's a lot we can do to really make them places of delight and joy.
And for those braver providers, how can they balance the conservatism that the legislation brings to the space, and traditionally a lot of the organisations are relatively conservative, and being able to be a little bit brave and be a bit out of the ordinary to make it this wonderful place of celebrating someone's life rather than necessarily being the God's waiting room, as they used to say.
Well, a lot of them really are. And there are some organisations that are really focused on residential care as their core business, and they are putting a lot of effort into the care offering and the whole sort of activities lifestyle piece that they provide. People like Opal Healthcare who, just do residential care, so they're not overlapping their business with independent living and retirement villages, it's just residential care. So they have really developed a very almost, I suppose, bespoke type of product that they have taken quite strong ownership of. And with the Royal Commission and the focus on more intimate group home type settings, a lot of people are building things of a smaller scale. So, even if it's a big building, you still have households that are quite small. So you have a sort of group of people of maybe 10 to 15 people. So it's not sort of living in that huge, big environment where you have a mass dining hall and everyone's bashing around making a noise.
And it doesn't feel like a hospital ward.
It doesn't feel like a hospital ward. So you have, a lot of effort goes into making them acoustically comfortable, to having soft spaces, to having character inside that feels comfortable, and it's really reassuring from a sort of domestic scale perspective.
And I think that's really important, and I guess would also be challenging, of how do you make a space familiar, but at the same time make it familiar for all sorts of people that have come in from different backgrounds. And I know Calder Flower does a lot of work in the dementia space, which is even more important, of having that familiarity. And I've seen a couple of the places that your firm's designed that feel like, something I'd book on Airbnb for a country getaway.
That's nice to hear. I've done a lot of research into it and have learnt a lot from other people's research, but I like to try and provide a bit of my own perspective on these things. You can never understand someone's background, and everybody's had a completely unique experience in terms of their upbringing, their cultural identity, where they grew up. What they would recognise as familiar is quite different. I really don't like the sort of cliched stylistic references to, old-fashioned fireplaces, and some of those things they don't work. They can have the opposite effect. I think you just got to keep things in a sort of contemporary sense, but with interesting textures, and really pay attention to the detail. But the thing that I really sort of follow strongly is that the thing that is most common to everybody, whether they're young or old, is the fact that we are human, and human beings all have a set of senses that are built into our body. So your body is programmed to respond to environmental changes and things that you experience. So being able to give people access to those experiences is a huge memory trigger. Just being able to smell the rain after a big storm. Today, everyone's skipping around after the big rain, just thinking how wonderful it is to see blue sky and to smell all the sort of damp earth. Those are memories that go far back. And so when people can access those memories, it's reassuring. And memories come from sound, it comes from things you smell, it comes from the smell of coffee brewing, or you're hearing birds playing in a little puddle. There's so many memory triggers that come from just that sensory.
So really
space.
what you're saying is creating human spaces.
Human spaces that are connected to the outdoors, and the link with nature, biophilic design, and just connection with the world is really important.
And how does that happen, especially with a lot of the constraints of space and housing that we're all facing? And there's a lot more vertical villages and high-rise aged care popping up. How can those outdoor spaces and green spaces, blue spaces, if you like, how can they be integrated into a community?
That's on multiple levels. I think you can do it really well by having a variety of outdoor spaces that people can get to, whether it's a terrace, a Juliet balcony, a roof garden, or you may have to travel in a lift down to the ground or up to the roof. But just the connection between your indoor space and your outdoor space is so important. So you don't always need the air conditioning on. You can just open the doors, and just the climate that we have in Sydney is just so temperate and perfect so many days of the year that you just want to have that natural experience of feeling what outdoors is like.
And I guess an example, making an effort to understand where the prevailing winds come from of certain directions and the sun, and making sure that you've got openings, windows and doors that face those directions to get the breeze, be it a sea breeze or an afternoon breeze or whatever the case is.
That's right. I mean, you want people to be comfortable so they can't bake in the sun or have that sort of very glary afternoon sun coming in. So you do have to design for really good solar access and wind cross ventilation and those comfort aspects. That at the same time, you don't want people to just be fully comfortable all the time, because again, that sensory bodily reaction to a chill in the afternoon makes you just realize that it's chilly and that you're in the outdoor world. So those are just little triggers that again promote that familiarity.
And in terms of creating these communities, how does Australia stack up with some of the great design that might be happening in other markets around the world?
It's a good question. I think Australia does it very well. I think Australia's really focused on quality and improving these communities, but at the same time, they are still rather isolated communities. And so a retirement village or an aged care development is a sort of little bit of a separate standalone development that sometimes it's even fenced and gated and secure, but they don't always integrate really well with that co-generational community. There's a lot of effort going into trying to do that. But when you go to Europe, for example, you see how it works quite spontaneously. There's a lot of really comfortable, easy mix between older people living in older aged care or seniors housing developments with the local community because of that urban space. They have to share the common park or the ground plane, and there's a lot of permeability between those buildings that may be less focused on privacy. They're more comfortable with being seen.
And is a lot of that being driven culturally? I know in a lot of Asian cultures, it is very normal for the families to look after their mums and dads for as long as possible. And then it'd be interesting to understand the more multicultural we become here in Australia, how a lot of those cultural norms, be it from Europe or from Asia, are starting to influence the design and what the providers are needing to build here.
Definitely. And, some of those cultures have such a inbuilt respect for older citizens. They don't sort of look at aging as something really ugly and undesirable. The elders are wise and elders are respected and valued. I think we need to bring a bit more of that into our modern Australian world. But just having the mix between aged care and childcare, for example, is a good place to start because it brings children. Children don't judge, people on their age. They just judge them by what they can do with them and the interaction and the fun element. So we've done some really lovely developments, one in particular with a Chinese community, CAS, the Chinese Australian Services Society. In Campsie, we have a development there that's residential care, and it sits alongside their childcare centre, their after-school care, and their whole sort of community hall and seniors day centre. And they just blend seamlessly. There's a really comfortable mix of those two services because of the cultural reference. It's not a forced thing. It's something that's naturally available, and it's wonderful to see. It's really, really lovely.
And even from a practical point of view, being a parent of school-aged kids, I see that working so well when you've got two working parents.
That's right. Having grandparents involved in the childcare is also helpful, and sometimes they really love it. But yeah, just that balance. I think it's really important to keep older people involved in your life.
And sort of on that point, one of the trends that we're starting to hear about a lot is co-living. Traditionally, that has been something you would associate with younger demographics, share houses for uni students, for instance. How are you sort of looking at that concept through the lens of aged care and seniors living?
That's really interesting because in a way, aged care is almost co-living. It's communal living with people that you don't really know. For a lot of people, that's a really uncomfortable threshold because they're not familiar with communal living. And I always say, unless you've been a nun or you've been in jail, you're not really used to living with a great number of strangers. And when you're older, you're less receptive to change and forming new relationships sometimes. But co-living is a really good option for a lot of people who are living alone and are very isolated, socially disconnected, but just a very, very alone and with little opportunity to meet new people. So if you bring a cohort of people into a common environment, then it's easy for them to develop friendships and a bit of companionship and sharing daily rituals like meals and preparing food and just someone to sit and chat to about the news. There's an opportunity for it to be a bit more affordable because you are in your own apartment, but you're sharing a lot of the communal amenity. So by sharing those things, you're not having to provide them for every single person in their apartment. I think there's enormous potential for older people to look at those developments. And there are some groups actually where I see, groups of people in neighbourhoods who know each other, who've lived alongside each other for a number of years, who are getting older, wondering about their future, and they're living in sort of small, narrow terrace houses with many levels and narrow stairs. And they are sort of pulling their resources together to do their own development for a co-housing scheme where they know the people they live with, they have control over the quality of the development, and there's a lot of conversation around that space.
And I'm personally fascinated by that concept because one of the hesitations a lot of people face when they're going, do I move out of my home or do I stay in home for as long as possible, is that their community is there, their friends are there, their family are there. It's a bit scary to go into a pre-organized community and have an instant community of strangers
Yeah,
around you.
that's
So
right.
the whole idea of taking the community that you've lived with for years or decades
With you.
and organizing the structure and the care and the facilities and the services to service you as a group of people that already know each other, I find that very interesting. There's something in that.
There's a lot in that. Even if you collectively hire a really cool chef to give you a couple of really good dinner, collectively invest in an awesome wine cellar, or just things that you have common interest. You can choose who you're going to live with as well, and have people that have the same kind of outlook as you, so you're not all too different. There's a dementia village in Holland that is called the Hugewijk village, and it's really sort of the success of it is got these small little households of around 7 people, but they put people together that have all got a very similar background and reference. I think all the accountants go together and all the artists go together.
That's right.
But you need that, otherwise there's
Left
nothing.
brain people this way.
That's
right
right.
brain.
That's right. Otherwise you're too different and it's just too weird.
So from an architectural point of view, if you were to create that space for, say, a dozen couples, how would you go about designing that? That would be different from any old development.
At the moment, there's a lot of focus on the cost of construction and buildings that can be quite self-sufficient. So you want buildings that have, and the word sustainability is a bit of a cliched term, but you want buildings that can perform really well without demand on huge energy draws and services. So, you don't want air conditioning on all the time. You want to have good thermal mass so that you don't need to put crank the heating up, and the floor can hold a lot of heat from the sun naturally. You want to have a really high performing insulation envelope around the building so that you don't lose a lot of your heat through the windows, and you can stay cool in summer. Double glazing should be a given. It's a lot more affordable, and those sort of basic standards I think are really important just from a quality point of view, but also to manage your ongoing maintenance costs. And a lot of people are quite invested in that piece around the cost of living because it's going up so much. And then just really nice aesthetics. It's not an institution and you don't want it to look institutional. And I think you really need to make the people who live there want to feel really proud and excited to get home, excited to invite people over. It's got to represent a really good standard of living for them in terms of how it looks and feels.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And are you finding that there's providers in the industry that are starting to get that and are building
Yes.
to that, not to that standard, but a building to that concept?
Well, they are. And I think a lot of people are really grappling with what to build right now because of the funding changes and, the Aged Care Act is not going to be released for another year now. And then independent living is really sort of focused so heavily around the aging in place strategy. So,
which I was going to ask, is it's almost like independent living and home care is sort of swallowing up the
becoming
industry
aged care
because
as well.
Yeah, it's almost the New Zealand model of you only have to move once.
Yeah, that's the idea, and you can age at home. This is obviously a new home, but it's a home that's set up for you to be able to age in, and it's got the appropriate dimensions and sizes and access ways. And so you can move there with the certainty that you can stay there right through to the end. So aging in place means that those communities, whilst they may be really active and engaged at some point, they can age together, but then they become more and more needs dependent, and they'll need different levels of care, but they'll also draw on each other more just to look out for each other. And there are instances where neighbours sometimes feel they're doing too much for their neighbours because they're quite frail and they need to be there more and more. So it's just, I guess, finding that balance. This is why I think residential care still has a real relevance. So when people are in a very high care space and kind of alone in their apartment, maybe it is right to sort of move them into an environment where there's more people around.
And that's the challenge that so many families face. When is that window to actually move? The advantage of moving early is that the experience can be far more social and active rather than being a pure care discussion.
Aging communities are generally pretty active and they're pretty engaged with wanting to control how they get old. I think the providers are all trying to understand what the market wants at the same time as they're trying to work out what is going to work best from a funding point of view, and obviously that cost overlay of developing it.
So I think this gets to the heart of the challenge here. Lara, how as an architect do you balance the creativity and vision of your solution with the financial and legislative realities that all of the aged care sector faces in executing these wonderful ideas?
different providers have done different research, and some of them have got quite comprehensive briefs and strategies of what they want to deliver. Some of them really don't and look to us for guidance in terms of how they can move forward. In both scenarios, we really want to try and test what people are wanting to do in terms of that risk opportunity. So we will always put forward ideas that they may not have explored. And people talk about innovation. It's a word that can mean many things, but innovation really is drilling down into things that are new and different and trying to uncover new strategies that haven't really been used before. So a lot of providers are quite risk averse and they don't want to be the pioneer or the first one to do something different. So they'll wait quietly for somebody else to maybe be braver and do it first. But I think the industry really is just screaming out for innovation in terms of variety. So at the moment, a lot of the conversations are around luxury retirement living and the resort lifestyle and the sort of cruise ship model. And it's all sort of framed around a more sort of high-end product that obviously costs money, but is a sort of luxury piece. But that doesn't suit everybody, and I think we need to provide more variety for people. Some people want a more pragmatic offering that's not luxury because they haven't grown up with that sort of offering. They're used to a more sort of practical, hardworking type of building. So you need to, really provide a choice for people. So you can have the luxury one, you can have the very connected, slightly hippie, biophilic one that's got a lot of earthy elements, or you can have, ones that appeal to the creative communities, or ones that are those sort of nice, glossy, high-rise glass boxes that some people do want to live in. I mean, we as a practice have a philosophy that every building we do should be better than any building we've done before, but at the same time, no two buildings should ever really be alike, which is a challenge when you've got a reasonably sort of rigorous formula and, that repetitive modular layout of residential care. But you can really present them very differently because every site is completely unique. It has unique characteristics in terms of the landscape or the tree canopies that are available that you want to preserve and you want to work around and give that point of difference to that site because it's got that landscape element available. A lot of those sites that we work on have got, they're bushfire affected or they're flood affected or they've got riparian corridors and a lot of environmental overlays that make the planning to some extent more challenging, but because it's more challenging, you get a more interesting outcome and a very bespoke product that is tailored to meet that site. And it's really important for us as consultants to work with good quality consultants in the other areas like landscape and services and civil. And, we thrive working with really good collaborative teams to get the best out of a site, to, just have a little bit of a lesser impact on that site and, be careful and gentle with it.
Completely, and treat it with the love and the respect that it deserves, right?
For sure.
And on that, you were mentioning that not many people want to be the first to jump in the pool with new innovation and new designs, but obviously some have. What projects that you've worked on in space are you most proud of that have been from brave providers and have really sort of changed the conversation? And now you can take some of those ideas and go, look, you're not the first, but this is now, the standard's gone from here to here.
The one that comes to mind, I mean, I'm proud of every building this.
Of course,
this
it's not about ranking them. But
No, they're all good. But having the creative freedom is a big plus. And we've just finished a building up in Maitland for Fresh Hope Communities, and that's a big one. That's a residential aged care for 168 beds, which in today's standards is really big. It's in a regional area, so there's a different sort of catchment, I suppose, a wider catchment for people needing that type of accommodation. But we had a complete free brief. They didn't have a brief. They didn't have a lot of data on what they wanted. They didn't have a building they'd done before that they wanted a reference. This was going to be a new product for them. It was going to sort of a bit of a pioneering space. It was a beautiful site. It is a beautiful site with this beautiful riparian corridor, beautiful mature trees, awkward sloping site. But because of those constraints, we ended up with a building that is, I think, is beautifully connected with that landscape. It's responded so well to the site. It is also, retrospectively, when we look at it, it meets all of the requirements that the Royal Commission have put forward for small home models, even though we had designed it before then. It was something that was sort of instinctively happened. So we have these beautiful little communities that have residents that can live indoors but still remain really connected to that outdoor landscape. It's really important for someone who is mostly inside to be able to follow the pattern of the sun through the day, to know where your body is in time and space in terms of just the body clock. So those are things that we really hold on to quite strongly. And I think that building does all those things.
I think it's so true what you said about following the sun. Even before our conversation this morning, you mentioned this sunshine after the rain. I was sitting on a park bench near your office in the sun for 10 minutes, and it just rejuvenated me.
It fills you. Yeah, absolutely. And so just, they always say food tastes better outside. And if you can just go and have a lunch outside on a terrace and listen to the birds and, smell the flowers, your food is going to taste better. Food is a multi-sensory experience. It's not just the taste and the flavors of it. And you don't want to be put off your food by smelling the steamy bain-marie next to you or the flickering fluorescent light above you that sort of just diminishes some of the visual effect. You need to really experience those moments fully, especially when they're rare and your moments of joy perhaps are a little less.
And it comes back to what you were saying about these last years of somebody's life have the potential to be some of the best.
Yeah.
And if you can make just those day-to-day moments from where you sleep, where you have breakfast, where you go in the afternoon, and having those sensory experiences being positive, then that's a big chunk of it.
It is. It's a bit like that reference back to the Eagles Hotel California, which talks about mirrors on the ceiling and pink champagne on ice and a bit of a hedonistic space. But, why not? Why not just be a little mad? Because a lot of older people are a little mad, just a little bit eccentric, and just go with it. Just really have a bit of fun.
And that's right. I think you get to that point in your life and you know what you like, you know what you don't like. There's no point being subjected to things you don't like. It should be all about, this is what suits me personally.
That's right.
And being able to design for that, I think, is potentially the key.
Yeah. No, you can have a lot of fun with it. I love what we do. I love the impact that our buildings have on families and people's lives. Again, having the clinical background, we always look at how the buildings feel, or imagine they would feel for people to work in. Caring for people is hard. It's not an easy job. It's a really challenging profession. And if you can work in a space that inspires you and you really look forward to going to every day, you're going to be better at your job. You're going to be a better carer if you're happier in your
And I think
workplace.
that's a really good point that we don't really talk about when it comes to building facilities and aesthetics. We talk about the needs of the residents. That dominates that conversation. But in an industry that struggles to find and retain quality staff, then making sure that the staff room isn't some dodgy room hidden at the back, they're coming into an environment that is a pleasure to be in. I think that would do a lot for retention.
Yeah, and it's just a sign of respect for them as well by giving them quality facilities. It's just, I suppose there's a sense of value in having that. A building like residential care or even, a seniors development is perceived in different ways by the different people who go there. For some people, it's very internal. They live inside for most of their time and they don't necessarily walk outside and stand back and look at their building and think, oh, that's a really nice elevation.
I like the angles.
Yeah, but then you have that building sitting in the community in maybe a suburban landscape or a context where you've got people who are just living alongside it, and you want them to be proud of the building that is in their community as well, so that they don't think, oh, we've got this shitty nursing home next door, but they actually think, well, we love the building and it's really uplifted the neighborhood, and it's a wonderful place just to walk through or to go and have a coffee in or just to share.
Exactly. And, we talk about co-living, and as we know, there's a major affordable housing crisis for workers in big cities, particularly Sydney, where we live. And surely there is an idea to, not that people necessarily want to live where they work, but there's an idea to combine affordable housing for younger people and workers and seniors housing in maybe not the same building, but the same general geographic area, which is going to reduce commute times. It's going to mean shared facilities. Like, there's something in that.
I love this topic. And we do touch on it quite often with different clients. The planning legislation conflicts this. if you're doing seniors housing, you can't necessarily put key worker housing on the same site because it doesn't fit in with the planning legislation. It should. It really should. And as I said earlier, when I was a student nurse, I lived in the nurses' accommodation next to the hospital.
Well, that creates community amongst the
and
workers,
so all
right?
the doctors and nurses were sort of hanging out in the residences next door. It took 5 minutes to get to work if you slept in or you had a big night. It was quick to get there. That association was a positive. It wasn't that you were living at your workplace. It was a good thing, particularly as a lot of the carers are brought in from overseas and they come from far away and they're not necessarily from Sydney or wherever they're working. So they don't have a home and they don't have a base. And I think to provide accommodation for them is a wonderful gesture.
I completely agree. And it's a little bit like, if you think about, the analogy I'm going to give is seasonal resort workers. If a young person might do a season in a ski resort or a beach resort or something like that, is that the big employers there will provide generally staff housing because it's in an expensive holiday area. They couldn't necessarily afford it. And it means that they have that working community. It kind of makes it fun. And there's no reason why this couldn't happen in our industry, because with the cost of housing, both rental and ownership, there's a big difference between what people can afford where they work. So often the people that are servicing our industry have huge commutes coming from cheaper rental areas. And again, that's not going to be helping the issues around retention and the value for the employees.
No, I agree. I mean, this is a hot topic right now with affordable housing and, the whole new TODCEP, which is coming in, and the transport networks that are trying to really ramp up densities for residential development. So maybe that is a small step in the right direction, and it will help be able to provide workers accommodation near where they work. I do think it would be good to provide it with the development and integrate it. I think that would be a great positive if we could get there. So hopefully.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting, because it feels with housing generally at the moment, all ideas are coming onto the table, because we've realised that we're caught between a demographic issue, reduction in taxation bases and ageing baby boomers coming into this space, and something needs to be done. And it's obviously a big challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. So I guess, how are you feeling about the next decade? Obviously, the one constant is going to be change. It's going to be massive upheaval. But are you feeling optimistic?
Very optimistic, like hugely optimistic. I think, I love the dialogue around affordable housing, and it does cross over into seniors housing as well, because a lot of older people don't have the means to buy into a luxury retirement development, but they need to be supported in being able to age in place in the right kind of accommodation. And whether that's a co-located community with all kinds of age groups and families, or in a separate community that's for older people, it's really their choice. We have been doing quite a few studies with different clients around housing for vulnerable women. It's another hot topic. Is a lot of aging women don't have enough financial means to really support themselves, or they've had hard lives and they haven't really. They've suffered a bit of trauma, and they're afraid, and they fear for their safety and security. And so providing housing that can alleviate those fears, that they can feel safe in, and that they know that they have some longevity in, and they won't be evicted, and they won't have to change and find somewhere else, is very important. And that kind of comes back to some of the build to rent product as well that's being talked about, where you can rent for the long term without being evicted and being told to move. So, a lot of housing for older people is about safety and security, as well as the other pieces we've talked about. But older people feel vulnerable because they're fearful, because the future they don't know what it's going to hold. They don't know how long they're going to live. They don't know how much money they're going to need, and they don't know what their health is going to do. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and the accommodation needs to provide some reassurance for that. And
do you feel that governments and providers, the industry, everybody is on the same page there?
No.
No.
No, there's a lot of separate conversations happening in separate bodies. Councils have got a lot of opinions about things, but then the Department of Planning may be slightly different. Then there's planning ministers with new strategies for providing housing that don't necessarily address seniors housing communities. There's a lot of separate conversations happening. It's inevitable that that would happen, and I don't have an answer for how those issues would be fixed. But having more conversations, the media has a role to play as well in getting a lot of that conversation into the public space and include the public in a lot of the decision making, because they're educated, informed people who have a lot to contribute. There's a lot of value in understanding what people want.
And I also think creating a forum to champion some of the successes. It's very easy to point fingers and talk about how the system's broken, but be able to sort of shine a light on what's being done that's working.
Definitely. And I mean, we've been lucky enough to win various awards over time for buildings that have been successful, and those do promote some of those successes. There's a building out in Penrith that we did for Tulich communities, which was part of the Penrith Panthers master plan. The Royce is a vertical village. It's not high rise by some standards, but it's 6 stories of vertical living, 130 apartments, 130 aged care beds. It's a very integrated community, independent community and care community. It's been hugely successful, partly because of the design, but I think mostly because of the operations and the business that run it. And that's a shining example of really seeing thriving aging communities work well together. And I think that's getting a bit of publicity. Royce Simmons is their ambassador, and it's named after him, and he's doing a lot of fundraising for dementia awareness, and different organisations in their own way get a lot of exposure to those wins and successes. So it's good that everybody's playing their part.
Look, it's fantastic. And I think that the work that yourself and your firm do in creating these and really trying to challenge existing norms and to find those brave customers and providers is what's ultimately changing the dial. Because once something like the Royce is built, that becomes a new standard.
That's right.
And that's how things progress.
Yeah, and for them that was a brave step because they hadn't done something like that before, and they took a punt on doing something that was quite a big development, a big scale, and a different product for that Penrith community that hadn't been built before. But yeah, it's been very successful. So, you got to dare to be different and be, like you say, brave. Get out there and just do it.
Well, it's been wonderful to chat with you, Lara.
Likewise, thank you so much. It's always good to talk about this. I could probably talk all day, but thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
Pleasure.